Look at a globe, and two things stand out before anything else. Two caps of white, the frozen top and bottom of our world, the Arctic and Antarctica. They feel permanent, eternal, as fixed as the oceans themselves, but they're not. In fact, for most of our planet's history, they didn't exist at all. There was a time, and not as long ago as you'd think, when you could have sailed to the North Pole and found no ice. None. When palm trees grew in the Arctic and crocodiles swam in waters that are now frozen solid. When the entire Earth, pole to pole, was a hot, green, dripping greenhouse, and the very idea of a polar ice cap would have seemed impossible. This was the last time our planet had no ice at all, and understanding what it was like and what ended it tells the strangest story about the world beneath your feet. Let's go back to the iceless Earth. To find this world, we have to travel back about 50 million years, long after the dinosaurs were gone, into the age of mammals. The continents had nearly drifted into the shapes we'd recognize today, but the world they sat in was almost unrecognizable. This period is called the Eocene, and it was one of the hottest chapters in our planet's entire history. There were no permanent ice sheets anywhere on Earth, not on Greenland, not on Antarctica. The poles, instead of being frozen deserts, were warm, wet, and covered in forest. Think about what that actually means. The average global temperature was far higher than today. The oceans were warm bathwater, even at high latitudes. There was no snow line, no glaciers grinding through valleys, no frozen tundra. Sea levels were dramatically higher because all the water that's currently locked up in ice was, back then, simply part of the sea. And the heat changed everything about how life was distributed. The lush tropical conditions we associate with the equator stretched almost all the way to the poles. A traveler in the Eocene could have journeyed from the equator to the far north and barely noticed the kind of brutal climate gradient we have today. The whole planet was, more or less, a warm and humid hothouse. It's a version of Earth so alien to us that it's hard to even picture. We think of the world as having frozen poles and warm middles, but that arrangement is actually the exception, not the rule. For vast stretches of deep time, the iceless greenhouse was the planet's natural state, and the Eocene was the last great example of it. So, what did this hot, green, poleless world actually look like? Let's start at the top, at the North Pole that wasn't frozen. Picture the Arctic Ocean today, a vast sheet of pack ice, polar bears picking their way across the frozen surface, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Now erase all of it. In the Eocene, the Arctic was a warm, swampy, temperate paradise. Where there is now ice, there were forests of redwood and cypress, swamps thick with ferns, and slow rivers winding through the green. The water wasn't frozen. It was warm enough to swim in, dotted with floating ferns that bloomed across its surface in enormous quantities. And the creatures that live there are the real shock. In the rocks of the high Arctic, on islands that today are buried in snow for most of the year, scientists have found the fossils of animals you would never associate with the North Pole. They found turtles. They found alligators and crocodile relatives, cold-blooded reptiles that simply cannot survive a freezing winter, basking in an Arctic that was clearly anything but frozen. They found primates, the kind of tree-dwelling, warmth-loving animals you'd expect in a jungle, living in the land of the midnight sun. They found large mammals, tapir-like browsers, and strange early herbivores wading through the polar swamps. These animals still had to cope with one thing that hasn't changed: the months of total darkness that come with life near the pole. So picture it: alligators and primates and lush green forests, all plunging into months of warm, humid darkness every winter, then bursting back into endless summer light. A tropical world running on a polar clock. That was the top of the iceless Earth. And what was happening at the bottom, in Antarctica, followed the very same impossible pattern. We've already glimpsed it before. Antarctica before it froze. In the Eocene, the southern continent was still part of this great warm world, cloaked in temperate rainforest rather than ice. Southern beech trees, ferns, and mossy undergrowth covered the land, and strange marsupials and ancient birds moved through the green. The same kind of life clinging on at the bottom of the world that we saw thriving at the top. For a brief window of deep time, both ends of the Earth were green at once. The planet had, in effect, no cold storage, no freezer at either pole, just warmth, water, and life, wrapped all the way around the globe. But the iceless world wasn't only defined by its poles. It was a golden age for life everywhere, and especially for one group, the mammals. With the dinosaurs gone and the climate warm and rich, mammals were exploding into an astonishing variety of new forms, filling every niche the warm world had to offer. The forests teemed with early, often unfamiliar versions of animals we'd half recognize. The first tiny ancestors of horses, no bigger than a small dog, darted through the undergrowth. Early relatives of elephants, tapirs, and rhinos browsed the dense vegetation. And in the warm seas, one of the most important transformations in the history of life was underway. The ancestors of whales were leaving the land behind, wading into those warm oceans and beginning their slow return to the water. It was a planet bursting with warmth and life, top to bottom, edge to edge. A true greenhouse world at its peak. But even at its peak, the seeds of its destruction were already being planted, because the iceless Earth was about to start cooling down, and the freeze, when it came, would be merciless. So how do you take a planet with no ice at all, warm from pole to pole, and turn it into the frozen world we live on now? The answer is one of the great slow dramas in Earth's history, and it played out over tens of millions of years. It began with a gradual cooling. After the peak warmth of the early Eocene, global temperatures started to drift downward. The exact causes are complex and still studied, but a major piece of the puzzle was the slow movement of the continents and the changing chemistry of the atmosphere over immense spans of time. Bit by bit, the planet was shedding its heat. For a long while, the change was subtle. A hothouse cooling slowly toward something milder. The forests at the poles thinned. The warmth-loving creatures of the high Arctic retreated toward the equator. But there was no ice yet. The world was cooling, but it was still technically a greenhouse. Then came a tipping point, and it happened first at the bottom of the world. We talked about it before. The continents shifting, the gaps opening up around Antarctica, and the birth of that powerful circular current that sealed the southern continent off from the warm waters of the world. Cut off and isolated, Antarctica did what no land had done in tens of millions of years. It began to freeze. The first great ice sheet in ages formed at the South Pole. This was the moment everything changed. For the first time in a very long time, the Earth had ice again. And once that ice existed, it began to feed on itself. Because ice is white, and white reflects sunlight. And reflected sunlight means less heat absorbed, which means more cooling, which means more ice. The planet had flipped a switch, and there was no flipping it back. Once that switch was flipped, the cooling became a long, one-way journey into the world we know. Antarctica froze solid, locking away its forests and creatures under a growing dome of ice, that buried green world we explored before. But the planet didn't stop there. The chill kept deepening, spreading, tightening its grip over millions of years, and eventually, the cold reached the far side of the world. The northern hemisphere, which had stayed ice-free long after the south began to freeze, finally crossed its own threshold. Ice began to build at the North Pole, too, and that's when the Earth entered the rhythm it's still in today. Because the ice didn't just arrive and settle in quietly, it began to pulse. The planet swung into a series of ice ages, long, brutal cold spells where vast glaciers crept down over entire continents, burying what is now North America and northern Europe under sheets of ice miles thick. Then, for a while, the ice would retreat, the world would warm slightly, and life would flood back into the uncovered land. And then, thousands of years later, the ice would return and do it all over again. These cycles have repeated over and over for the last few million years. The mammoths and the saber-tooths, the Neanderthals, and our own ancestors, all of them lived inside this icehouse world, this rhythm of advancing and retreating glaciers. The frozen poles we think of as permanent are really just the most visible feature of an ongoing ice age that began when that ancient greenhouse finally collapsed. We don't live on the warm, green, iceless Earth. We live on the frozen wreckage of what came after it. And right now, we happen to be in one of the warmer pauses between the freezes. And if you've followed this story all the way from a green North Pole to the frozen world outside your window, you've understood something most people never stop to consider: that the planet we think of as normal is actually a planet in the middle of an ice age. This is exactly the kind of deep-time perspective that changes how you see everything. If you want to keep zooming out like this, to see our world not as a fixed backdrop, but as a living, changing thing with an epic history, then subscribe and stay with us, because every one of these lost worlds is a chapter in the same astonishing story, and we're working through all of them. Now, here's the part that brings this ancient history right up to the present. Because that iceless greenhouse Earth isn't just a curiosity from 50 million years ago, it's a record, a real physical example of what our planet looks like when it has no ice, how high the seas sit, where the heat reaches, how life rearranges itself across a warmer globe. Scientists study the Eocene precisely because it's the closest thing we have to a natural experiment in a hothouse world. The fossils in the Arctic, the chemical signatures in ancient seabeds, the buried forests of Antarctica. Together, they form a detailed picture of an Earth with no ice. It's not a hypothetical. It happened. The planet has run this experiment before and left the results in the rocks for us to read, which means the iceless Earth isn't only a story about the distant past. It's a window into the full range of what this planet is capable of being. So the next time you picture the Earth, those two white caps at the top and bottom, locked in place, eternal, remember that you're looking at a temporary state, a passing phase, one frame in a film that has been running for billions of years. For most of its history, this planet had no ice at all. Crocodiles basked at the North Pole. Forests blanketed Antarctica. Whales took their first swimming strokes in warm seas that reached almost to the ends of the Earth. The frozen world is not the default. The greenhouse is. We are the ones living in the unusual chapter, the cold one. And there's something humbling in holding both of those worlds in your mind at once. The same patch of ocean, that was once warm enough for alligators is now buried under polar ice. The same ground that grew redwood forests at the pole is now a frozen desert. Nothing about the surface of our world is fixed. Continents wander, oceans open and close, ice comes and goes. The Earth is not a stage that stays still while life performs on it. The Earth is the performance. The iceless world was real. It was here. And in the immense, patient timescale of the planet, it may simply be one of many faces this world has worn and will wear again, long after every map we've ever drawn has turned to dust. If this expanded your sense of the world, follow the channel so you can keep traveling through these lost ages with me and share it with 5 people who've never imagined a North Pole without ice. Then tell me in the comments, which lost world should we bring back to life next? I read every single one. I'll see you in the next lost world.